Welcome to Leadership 2020. I'm Liska Turner. I'm an executive recruiter that specialises in the for-purpose sector. I work with boards and charities to help them build sustainable businesses by introducing them to amazing people and sharing new ideas. For-purpose leaders are as diverse as the sector that they represent. Each month, I get to sit down with a leader and talk all things leadership with them. This month, my guest is Kylea Tink. Kylie's background is as diverse as the opportunity she's taken advantage of, but I'll let her tell you a bit more about that. Over to you, Kylie.
Thank you, Liska. It's a pleasure to be here, so thank you for having me. I think it's interesting, when I reflect on my life, if I was being really honest, I think I was born a campaigner because I'm one of 4 children who never took no as an answer, if truth be told. But I'm very fortunate with my career, as you know. Most recently, I've had the opportunity to be the CEO for an extraordinary Australian children's cancer charity called Camp Quality. So I was there for 3 years, leading the organisation through quite a robust process of change. Prior to that, I was actually with another not-for-profit called the McGrath Foundation. I was the CEO there for 6 years in the period immediately following Jane McGrath's passing. So it was there for a time of immense growth and transformation, and the establishment of some of the things that charity is probably most recognised for, both nationally and internationally now.
That would be the Pink Test?
The Pink Test, yeah, which is something that, still even I sometimes do a double take about. But before that, my background was actually in public relations, so public relations and marketing. So I think the one thing that fundamentally informs my entire professional experience was my grandmother describing me when I was younger as somebody who loves to hear other people's stories and tell stories. And that's what I've been fortunate enough to do in all of my roles today.
Thank you. So, storytelling. Let me take it one step back, actually. In the climate today of Royal Commission, so we've had the Royal Commission into financial services, and we're standing on the brink of something that could really shake our sector with the Royal Commission into disability. And culture's been a word that's been bandied about a lot. What do you see the role of the CEO in shaping culture?
I think the CEO plays an absolute fundamental role in shaping the culture of any organisation. And I think what's particularly interesting about the power of the CEO role is that depending on the person who goes into that function, you can have very different cultures. Because people are fundamentally human. So we all have our own strengths and our own weaknesses, and we have things that we will be very naturally drawn to versus things that we may pull back from. I know I've seen it across a number of the roles that I've had, whether it was the CEO that I was reporting to or myself as a CEO in an organisation, being able to read the environment within which you find yourself, not only in terms of your internal stakeholders, but actually really importantly your external stakeholders and their expectations of you, and finding a way to align those two things, I think is absolutely essential to the CEO role. And in that context, I think that requires a CEO to be able to listen and to intuit and to be able to kind of take that pulse, as much as it requires a CEO to also be able to model and then lead and actually pick up the mantle and carry it forward.
So talking about the modelling piece, because, as CEO, you can be seen as the boss and people don't necessarily want to engage with you, particularly the more junior staff. So practically, what are some of the things that have really worked for you that have helped cascade that culture direction down the organisation?
It's actually, I've had a number of interesting experiences as a CEO, and probably I'm quite a different CEO today than what I was 10 years ago. And I say that because 10 years ago, I think as a CEO, my modus operandi was I never asked anybody to do something I wasn't prepared to do myself. So I embodied the values and the vision and the culture. If I wasn't walking it, I would wear pink to work every day.
Yes. You did pink everything from recollection.
I did. But what I learned as a CEO, having lived that way, is that actually that wasn't enough for an organisation, because in fact, as a leader, I was almost too strong in carrying it forward. So people would mimic me, but they looked to me for the direction on how it should be expressed. So I do know in my more recent role at Camp Quality, for me, what was really important to get back, getting the cultural piece right there, was to make sure that I empowered other people around me to be able to shape it and verbalise it and live it. And that was a really challenging thing to do.
I was about to say, there's a lot of trust in doing that, isn't there?
Yeah, it is. Because I think it does, I'm often struck by the fact that you can sit and have a conversation and the things that come out of your mouth will be heard one way in your own ears, but the person listening may hear it a completely different way.
And then I suppose when it works, that trust, it just ripples into everything else and all your other communication that you have across the business. All right, so something a little bit more tricky. What's the role of a board in culture?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually. And I think it's a really good question, particularly in the not-for-profit sector, because I think some of the operating principles that we have around boards in not-for-profit is quite different to the commercial sector. So things like, tenure on board and selection process. But I'm waffling. I think when it comes to the board's responsibility in cultures within not-for-profit organisations in Australia, predominantly they have to be prepared to live the culture as well. So once it's clearly articulated that this is the style of organisation you want to build, it's really important that every single board member sitting around that table is aligned to those cultural aspirations.
So what advice would you give a CEO to get the board, because you're asking a board to change and they don't always want to change. You're asking them to change their behaviour because their motivations are often quite different to coming onto a board as to what a staff members might be. So what practical advice?
This is definitely something I'm still learning. But what I would share is, I think for me there's a couple of key observations. Number one, you've got to be really clear on what it is that's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And you then need to be able to have the strength to be able to hold your board as accountable as you would hold yourself or someone below you. And in fact, I was speaking to another CEO not that long ago talking about the role of board in her organisation, and it was such a fascinating lesson, because what she shared with me, it was that her board has an in-camera session at the end of every board meeting. But the only reason they have that in-camera session, an in-camera session is where the CEO and executive is excluded from the board meeting for a period of time. The only reason her board has that in-camera session is to actually just to discuss how well they performed as a board in that board meeting.
Wow.
Did they actually...
That's a first. I've never heard that before.
Did they give the CEO good advice? Were they constructive in their feedback? Were they aligned to the strategy as they'd previously discussed? Were they, did they have robust discussions rather than sit back? And I heard that, and that to me was like, wow, that's nirvana.
I work with a lot of boards and I've never heard that before.
That's nirvana. Whereas my personal experience has been previously that the board will meet before you get into a room. And so then coming in as a CEO, you can sometimes feel like you're coming in on the back foot because there's already been a conversation had before you've even got there.
Money's always tight in the for-purpose sector, and you have to be able to advocate long and hard to, I suppose, access discretionary funds. Do you think that an investment in getting some external support around shaping culture, particularly at a board level, is a valuable investment?
So I think there's two things to this. Definitely, I think external perspective is always really important. The key to being able to effectively engage external perspective, though, is to know that the people that person is coming in to see are willing to listen or to be able to change. So taking it one step further, I'm a massive advocate that I actually believe directors in the not-for-profit space should be remunerated. I think that we need to move to a position, even if it's only a nominal amount, and even if it becomes the case that those directors may choose to donate that money back to the not-for-profit as a show of good faith. I think the reality is that the fact that we don't remunerate directors brings in a whole heap of, I'm going to call it baggage, I hope that's not too harsh, but a whole heap of attitudes around not-for-profit boards that you wouldn't find in the commercial sector.
And there is that remuneration, it's like the secret conversation. It happens, people just won't talk about it because of that external perception about what are we doing. But there's a degree of accountability that comes with it. When 100%. You pay somebody, they have to behave and they have to be there for the benefit of the organisation that they're providing strategic leadership to. We could talk a long time about that. So let's move on from boards and cultures. You've you started your career, the early part of your career in health and government.
Yes.
And then you worked for one of the largest international public relation companies.
Yes.
And fronted up in New York for director meetings, and then you landed in this tiny startup charity that you grew to 100 breast care nurses by the time you left, which was phenomenal achievement and something that was quite new. So you've worked in very different landscapes and then also been on a number of commercial boards. What's the same and what's different?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think it's always easier to focus on or to immediately articulate the differences.
Yep.
And I think when I reflect on my transition from the profit sector into the not-for-profit sector, the single largest difference was access to resources. As you said, my job immediately moving into not-for-profit had been with an amazing multinational public relations firm. I was on their global executive and working with some of the smartest people in the world, really. So if I ever had a question or a problem or a challenge, I had 100 people I could go to and say, how do we address this? And more often than not, because we were an international company, 24 or 48 hours later, I'd have an answer. I then wound up in the not-for-profit sector, and as you said, in a startup company where our computers weren't even networked. And I didn't know how to set up a network. So I think, what the biggest difference in my personal experience is the access to those resources that enable your business to function.
Yes.
Because I think you touched on it before, in the commercial sector, you would never hesitate to invest in something that makes your business better because your outcomes or your product becomes better. In the not-for-profit sector, I think there's a whole heap of psychology there that makes that investment sometimes tricky. Yeah. And in fact, I feel like that's a conversation that as leaders in this sector, we need to be advocating for and driving more.
And I think as there are more people that do what you do, and absolutely I see it, moving between sectors, tools of the trade is, when there are some very small charities that I work with that still think a paid mobile phone is a luxury for a CEO, but it's not. It enables them to be more efficient and to do their business. So if we talk about the difference, what's the commonality?
I think the commonality is that fundamentally, no matter what organisation you work for, you have an audience that you need to be able to satisfy the needs for. And what I do think that we're seeing a good shift for right across the business sector is how do we meet the expectations of our stakeholders? And you touched on it with the Royal Commission work. Those days of organisations being able to just look internally and ferret on, they're done. There's no transparency is key for everybody. And I think that is particularly appropriate across both sectors. I think the other thing across both sectors is you do get some incredibly talented people that will come into the not-for-profit sector as you will find in the commercial sector. I think sometimes there is a mistaken attitude within the commercial sector that just because you're working in the not-for-profit, you're overly heart-driven and you may not necessarily be as smart as somebody who might have an equivalent role in the commercial sector. It's just not true. You get very, very clever, smart, passionate people.
Well, sometimes you do more with less.
Yes,
so
correct.
It drives innovation and creativity as
Correct.
well.
Correct.
Maybe not as much as it should. Okay, so talking about really, really smart people.
Yeah.
You've grown businesses.
Yeah.
That's key to one of the things that you've done. So who do you choose to promote? How does succession planning work in what is often quite flat structured businesses?
Yeah. I'm probably a little bit unconventional.
Oh, really?
Look, I've been really fortunate to work in so many different environments. I've seen it done different ways, but I do think it's a combination of observing a person's key strengths and their capacity to put in on a role. And then I think as a good leader, I think sometimes it is gut instinct. You just, sometimes you've got to follow your gut on a person that everything else might tell you is not aligned.
So I did some work around the future of work recently, and one of the things that came out is that, people still want to have careers within the same organisation, but they're looking for opportunities to pivot. So am I hearing you say that you sometimes actually recognise the opportunity to give somebody a career pivot that made you unconventional?
100%. And even to the point that, where other people would be looking at me going, what are you doing? I'm going, just give him the chance, give him a go. And then you put him into that environment and they flourish. So I think there's a lot of noise about the differences between generations. But I look at this generation, I don't think they are that different to us. I'm a Gen X. I actually think they just want to be constantly challenged. And, that concept of pedestrianism for them, or the Groundhog Day, is not how you're going to keep them engaged. So to me, I think there is a real shift in the way that we need to think about promotions and succession, because I think it's something that should be happening every day, not just once every 6 months or once every, 12 months.
Bedded into the way that you work
100%.
And your workflows and your work structures are set up, almost like a matrix. Yes, which can be challenging for this sector because it's historically quite hierarchical in style.
And as a manager, just always being attuned enough to where your staff members are at, to be confident to ask for that little bit more, without drowning people, because I think you can sometimes do that. We all know we've all had high achievers that we've just thrown stuff at and then we've suddenly realised we've swamped them. But I think it is actually not kind of just sitting back. It's about just pushing your staff each time, and the successions become natural. It happens organically.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about, successions and spotting good staff members and opportunities for them. What do you do to sustain yourself? What's your best habit?
Look, my best habit is probably also my worst habit.
Do you tell?
I'm restless, I think. And by that, I mean I'm dissatisfied with status quo. So my best habit is that I will always ask why. Why are we doing it this way? And I will always ask, how else can we do it, or how else can we enhance this? And I'm not joking when I say it's probably my best habit, but also my worst habit, because I think sometimes when, I do know, working with both of my most recent teams, they would, give me that feedback sometimes, that just to keep up with me and where my thought process was at, because you may not be through 1 year and I'm already thinking 2 years down the track.
So then what would you do to support your team, knowing that about yourself and knowing what your best habit is? How do you support your team to take full advantage of that?
It took me a long time to learn that I needed to stop and explain to people how I was getting from A to C. Oh yeah, because I was going straight over the top of B. Yeah, exactly. So I'd go from here, I'd go from A, and all of a sudden I'd be going, right, so in 3 years' time we're going to have, pink baggies on all the players, and the team would be going, how did you get there? So then I'd have to come back and go, well, because the grounding of that is the brand is pink. So how can we infiltrate this event even further, kind of thing, to take them through that process? So explanation.
So if you forget what B is and you go straight to C, do you think that there's a blended future? We've moved from charity to not-for-profit to for-purpose to social enterprise, and I call them businesses, not organisations, because fundamentally they're businesses. Do you think that there's a future for blended organisations? Am I making sense?
Yeah. I think I get I understand where you're coming from. If I could do anything, I would kill the word charity from the business vernacular, because I think, a little bit like a couple of the other things we've spoken about, the word charity brings with it a whole heap of psychology. People have preconceived ideas around what a charity is. I also can't help but think that there is a massive opportunity for commercial entities to be doing more in the for-purpose space. I just think, we know, all the science tells us that employees want to feel connected to something bigger than themselves. So the realm of doing good in society isn't something that should be isolated in for purpose. I do. I think there's a massive opportunity. And some companies, you look at a company like J&J, for example, Johnson & Johnson, they're doing some amazing stuff with the for-purpose partners that they work with. But in talking to them recently, it's taken them nearly 4 years to massage that relationship even with their charity partners, to help their charity partner understand what they were wanting to do. You know, they don't just want to be givers, they want to be outcome deliverers.
And that language is really interesting. You know, here at Beaumont, we're about to do a whole piece of work, or we are, on meaningful work, because, you know, what's meaningful is different at different points in your career, and it's different to different people. But when you hit that sweet spot as a business with your employee, you get so much more out of them, and then their sweet spot might need to change, and they might need to move on. And that's certainly something that we're exploring here. So in a way, if we're not careful, the commercial sector can almost take some market share from us.
Well, I actually, it's funny you say not careful. I almost think that should be an aspiration. So one of the things that's always really struck me about the not-for-profit sector, even as I entered it, is that surely we are the one sector that should be in the business of putting ourselves out of business.
Yes.
And I think that is a very challenging thought.
The federated experience would disapprove of that.
I just think that, and I remember very early on in my career sitting on a panel with multiple CEOs. One was in homelessness, there was me at McGrath and somebody else. And the whole room was talking about, fundraising and how complicated the market was. And on this panel, I guess I was new, I just sort of said, well, hang on. I turned to the guy in homelessness and said, do you know what you need to fix homelessness? And he said, yes, I do. I said, great. What if I said, I'm going to sit my charity down for 2 years, you fix homelessness, and then I'll come back into the sector? And I was being contentious. I was trying to cause a debate. But this guy was like, well, no, you can't do that. I'd still have to run a campaign to fundraise. And why? Why? If you fundamentally fixed your problem, why are you still keeping yourself in business? So, that's a long way around. Coming back to what you just said, I think wherever a charity can see an opportunity to put itself out of business, that's what we should be doing. As long as the outcomes are still being delivered to our stakeholders. And the only final thing I would say is I don't think there is a single business in this country or on the face of the planet that can afford to be anything less than socially focused these days, because it doesn't matter if you make cars, if you make bath bombs, if you're a food producer, if we're not all incredibly socially aware, there's going to be nobody to buy stuff. So we have to be bigger than just a singular focus.
And I think the bushfires have really hit that home. Just talking to people, I was talking to someone this morning. I had no petrol in my car. I couldn't access the bank. I couldn't buy the petrol. My phone didn't work. I was traumatized because this isn't my everyday life experience. And I think that's really shifted at a ground level how people see themselves, and that we are all connected. It's not somebody else's problem. So,
as Australians, we're incredibly lucky. We've not had any conflict on our home soil for 200 years since Europeans showed up here. So for us to have had something like the fires most recently, it has really brought home to everyday Australians, what does it mean to have to live in a world that's uncertain? And there's no doubt, that's where not-for-profits really come to the table. They, provide services in that area. But I think the singular thing we saw, and you touched on it, Liska, is it wasn't just the space of the not-for-profits to do something about that. Everyone. You've even got Woolworths giving, 10% off to the fireys as they shop.
Okay, so we talked a bit about your best and your worst habit, which was restlessness. As an entrepreneur and an innovator, where do you draw inspiration from? Who do you read? Who do you listen to? You don't operate in a vacuum.
No, I don't. It's interesting, actually. I think I love Harvard Business Review, but that seems really obvious. But I really do love it. I find that often I'll read something there and it'll force me to think about how I'm framing something. There's a lady called Kathy Burke, who was the CEO of the Hunger Project for a really long time, who I follow online. I really love the way that Kathy talks about leadership. So she worked for many years in microfinancing with females in communities that were living close to the borderline and revamping those communities. But actually, the other place I go to for inspiration is just the real world. So I'm very fortunate to have a diverse group of friends who have very diverse social media platforms. So whether it's Facebook or Instagram, and actually I think it's just I am often inspired by what I see happening on a Facebook post. You know, somebody will put something up and I'll go, yeah, that's a really good point. Or why hasn't that question been answered? So I think it's a combination of consuming things from, you know, people that are smarter than me, that have observations. But then at the same time, it's about being tuned in on channels that get me really close to real people right now. And I think what's interesting about that working for me is that I think that's what politicians don't do well, because, you know, you could see the trends around where the political landscape was moving around those fires within 12 hours of them breaking, yet you could see our politicians just trailed that so far behind. So I think, again, just that being really close to your stakeholders is often the place where you'll get your inspiration. I will say at the Camp Quality too, some of my most significant innovations at Camp Quality were driven by conversations with the families.
Oh, like your app, like the app,
like
for
the
example.
app,
the
like,
new normal.
The new normal navigator was from talking to a mum at a function one night, and she told me about something she was challenged by, and I was like, we can fix that. Again, it's that stakeholder thing.
Good idea around the restlessness.
Yeah.
So normally I ask the question now, you know, what advice would you give a new leader? But I think the thing, one of the things that's when you talked about social media, it got me thinking. You are as CEO so strongly identified as you are the Camp Quality CEO, you are the McGrath Foundation's CEO. But in this world of interconnectedness where you see ideas and you have opinions, how as a leader do you stay true to yourself and continue a broader conversation where you challenge status quo and you want to comment on the sector that you're involved in, but still stay true to the values or adhere the party line, or help me out here, Kylie. But the difference between CEO Camp Quality, campaigner, not-for-profit sector leader, for-purpose leader, social advisor, how do you balance the two?
I think personally, for me, I've never actually been able to separate the two. Okay. So for me, it's about authenticity and integrity. And in fact, when I reflect on my career, in those moments where I've been at points of crisis, because, you know, you're not living if you're not challenging yourself, and we do all hit those points. When I've been able to step back and look at it, I've realised it's because I'm trying to follow a party line that fundamentally I can't sit with. So I do think it's a challenge. I think obviously some people are better at it than me, but for me it's always been a case of, unless I'm authentically committed to something or connected to something, I can't advocate for something I don't believe in. And that's been right from the get-go when I was selling Listerine for, you know, halitosis in PR 25 years ago. I believed in fresh breath, you know. So,
you did. Okay, so well then what advice would you give a brand new CEO? What would old Kylie give young Kylie?
Yeah, and actually I've had, as you know, I'm not working at the moment, which is amazing. So I've had some time to stop and reflect on
which
is
why I managed to get you to finally talk to me. And it is, I think I've had some really strong learnings in the last kind of 3 to 5 years. One of them is it is really important as you go into an organisation as a CEO to be really clear on what is the legacy that you want to leave within the organisation. And to then, as a CEO, to be quite fierce about protecting the space around your role that will require you to deliver that legacy. So if you suddenly end up with a vacancy in your senior executive team, don't get sucked into suddenly becoming, you know, the quasi head of HR or the quasi head of fundraising. Stay in your CEO space. Your priority needs to be getting the right person back into that role as quickly as you can, because it's very easy, in my experience as a CEO, to get pulled out of your course to problem solve, because that's the thing, CEO. So number one, know what legacy you want to create, and then be absolutely ferocious in protecting the space that you need to do that. Number two, trust in your vision, and, you know, be brave in clearly articulating it, and be prepared to have the arguments that may be required to protect it going forward. I think, again, sometimes as a CEO and a not-for-profit, you have really smart people who are being kind enough to give you their time,
And so there's a little bit of a sense of, I have to value your time almost more than mine because you're giving it to me for free. I know for me personally, on occasion, that's meant I've probably gone, maybe I compromise on that. And in hindsight, I shouldn't have done that.
And I suppose also it's their choice to give you that time. And it's an equal partnership. I mean, all good partnerships start on an equal footing, don't they?
Correct.
Yeah.
And then my final piece of advice is don't think it's going to be easy. I think a lot of people, come out of the commercial sector having really big jobs, high pressure jobs, and they think going to work in a place where their heart is being drawn to, they're going to feel so much better about themselves. But I can honestly say, I worked, PR consulting in the era where it was really long hours, it was 7 a.m. till 3 a.m. But I can still say without a word of a doubt, I've worked harder since I've entered the not-for-profit space, because at the end of the day now, the work you do as a CEO and not-for-profit is about affecting people's lives at a very fundamental level. And it's much harder to say, no, I'm not going to get up and do that on that day. So I think being aware that it is a business environment, you are likely to not have all the resources you're used to having, and being able to pace yourself and recognising that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So how can you get to the end result?
And I suppose also your stakeholders aren't just looking at a share price. Your stakeholders have that heart. There's that extra component that you don't really get always in a commercial business as well.
There is another, the fourth thing I would say about being a really good CEO in not-for-profit is that actually, and this is not, I hope I'm not being self-serving, but I think there's a really important part of you knowing when it's the right time to walk away. And to let somebody else come in and take that on, and I know I definitely experienced that with the McGrath Foundation. It was almost this epiphanous moment for me where there was no reason for me to leave at that point in time, but I knew it was the right time. And similarly with my most recent experience, it was the right time. So I think often that your legacy can only be as strong as your capacity to be prepared to hand it over to somebody else. And that's something you need to do as CEO.
Different businesses, I mean, I certainly see that different businesses go through these organisational journeys, and that ability to recognise when you've come to a natural fork in the road and then it's time to hand over to somebody else, and they can evolve in a different way, which just refreshes the business as well. So my last question, thank you for your time, but my last question is, what leadership decision are you most proud of?
There's so many. A lot of my best leadership decisions have been around other people. So that have been around identifying somebody who I just felt was the right person to put into a role at a particular point in time. I do think that, I just touched on it, but my other I'm most proud of is my capacity to have moved on when the time was right. Because that's not an easy decision to make. But I think, for things, the Sydney Pink Test is a great example of that. The fact that I moved on at the right time, and that event has just gone from strength to strength without me, and I'm a mere blip in its history. But I'm still so super proud of it, because I think that was a brave decision to walk away at that point in time. So I think they would be the things that and it's just not, it's a hard thing, and I know every CEO does it, but not being afraid to take the bullet sometimes, like when your organisation is under the pump, I do think that it is the CEO's role to step forward. No matter what's going on behind you, it is the CEO's role to step forward and to protect your organisation's brand and presence, and to do what you have to do within your capacity. And I think that's when you develop a lot of respect from your stakeholders, from your staff. And I've done that a number of times during my career, and while at the time personally it takes a lot from you and it can be very hard to get through, I don't look back on any of those experiences and regret them. They were the right decisions at the time.
That's great. Kylie, it's been a delight talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and observations, and I certainly look forward to watching what you do next in your career, and I have a distinct feeling you might be hopping back on the other side of the commercial fence. Or maybe she'll find a blended role, and we'll be talking again in 12 months' time. Thanks a lot for joining us. Much appreciated. Cheers.